Hi there, my name is Ron Rogers, and this presentation is titled AIRSHOW TRAGIC ENDING, The Shortest Era, Thunderbirds Flying the Thunderchief F-105 Bravo. The Thunderbirds flew this aircraft for their shortest season so far since their inception in 1953. They've flown 8 different aircraft. This aircraft only flew 6 air shows. From April to May 1964, it flew 6 air shows, like I mentioned, and on the 7th one, during a pull-up, and I'll describe this in more detail, the aircraft catastrophically failed. The structure failed, and the pilot was killed. There was no surviving this accident whatsoever. Now, Republic Aircraft, of course, an aircraft company that no longer exists as an independent company, it's been absorbed, of course, but like a lot of companies have been. But back in the 50s, they had some interesting naming conventions. Of course, we have the F-105 Thunderchief. The Thunderbirds, starting in 1953, flew 3 different Republic aircraft. And for the first 130 shows in the first 2 years, from 53 to 55, they flew Republic's F-104G Thunderjet. For their 55 season, they switched to the faster swept-wing F-84F Thunderstreak. And then they switched again a year later to the supersonic North American F-100C Super Sabre. Now, switching to the F-105 Thunderchief almost didn't happen. The process started in 1958, and it was plagued with a lot of problems, a lot of maintenance issues in that. And in the interim, they thought about using the T-38, which is interesting because we all know that it had a also unfortunate short history much later. But this was back in '63 when they were considering using the T-38. And at the time, it was a nice, new, good-looking aircraft, but they TAC has always had, and I think rightfully so, the attitude of we want to use a frontline fighter in our demonstration because, okay, I flew the 38, I love the 38, and you go in an air show and watch it fly. Well, you go into training command, you won't get to fly the 38 like the Thunderbirds flew the 38, but it's an interesting aircraft and a beautiful aircraft and does a nice display, but it doesn't have the power or the majesty of a fighter like the F-105, or especially like the later ones, the F-4 and the F-16. Those aircraft just have a very great presence. So we almost had T-38s back in 1963, but they finally decided, TAC goes, it's got to look like a frontline fighter. And so they decided, we're going to go with the frontline fighter. We're going to go with the 105. Well, they had a lot of trouble with the conversion of the 105. Like I said, it went over a period of 6 years, and in fact, there was one period where the aircraft set for 18 months. They had a lot of wiring issues. The wiring was deteriorating, and of course, the team had gotten rid of their F-100Cs. They turned those in, and they were modified and sent back to squadron. So they kind of had no choice once they turned them over. They were going to a new aircraft, and by the time they turned the F-100Cs over, the 105 was supposedly ready to go. They made quite a few interesting modifications to it, though. They actually put in a smoke system that had the capability of doing colored smoke. The fingertip guys in the formation were going to have colored smoke where everybody else had white smoke. They never really ended up using this because one of the chemical components in the smoke was tetrachloride, and that is a toxic chemical, and spraying that on crowds probably wasn't the best PR thing to do for the Air Force. So they decided, no, we're not going to do that. But they had quite a few interesting modifications. Now, as for some of these modifications, the fuel system was modified. They ended up having a boost pump that operated in the inverted position to give them more inverted flight time. That, of course, is something very necessary, the way the aircraft is flown in the air show. They also did a few other interesting things. If you're familiar with the 105 at all, and the pilots who flew it love it, and it was a moving, fast low-altitude aircraft. And it had an interesting type of afterburner nozzle, if you will. They were actually, they functioned as nozzles and speed brakes. And they were 4 pedals, if you will, that when extended in the slipstream, they were speed brakes, but they're also used as nozzle, and in the non-afterburning sense, they were closed down. But when you go to afterburner, they need to open up to allow for the increased thrust. But what they did was they left the pedals essentially in the entire time in the afterburner section position, which will decrease overall thrust in normal military power up to 100%, but it allowed them to go to afterburner faster. Now, this was a much heavier aircraft than the F-100s they had been using, but it was also a much more powerful aircraft. So, more weight, but you counteract it with more thrust, and it put on a better show than the F-100s just because of the increased power. But they left these clamshells now open in the afterburner position. So instead of taking 5 seconds to go into afterburner to get the full afterburner, it only took 2 seconds. They also reinforced the vertical stabilizer with stainless steel. They did it obviously for the slot because he's sitting there in the exhaust of lead, so he needs a little more reinforcement. And they also did it for the solos who did the knife edge flight. And normally the rudder on the 105 was restricted to 8 degrees. Well, this is one thing the Thunderbirds did. They always increased rudder for, maneuver enhancement, let's put it that way. So they went from 8 degrees to 16 degrees, so they'd have more rudder for the knife edge. And they also, for more maneuverability, they left the leading edge flaps the ability to extend them to 4 degrees, and they allowed that up to a speed of 500 knots as opposed to the normal 275 knots. Now, the Thunderbirds received their last F-105B just 11 days before the start of the 1964 show season. Now, 5 of the 6 Thunderbirds had previous experience as Thunderbirds, but by the time the first show started, the majority of the pilots only had 10 hours in the aircraft. It's amazing to fly these type of maneuvers with such a little experience in the actual aircraft, but amazingly, a lot of these aircraft have similar flight characteristics. But the lack of amount of time wasn't a significant factor in this accident. And the first air show, naturally, since they were based at Nellis, occurred at Nellis Air Force Base. Now, of course, Nellis is their home base, so that air show that was flown in Nellis was just kind of for the local people. The first actual air show public performance occurred at Norfolk, Virginia. And after that performance, 2 days later, April 28th, 1964, they flew their second show at Pensacola, Florida, and they had 15,000 people in that audience. Heading west a day later, they flew their third demonstration at Randolph Air Force Base for a crowd of 42,000 people, the largest audience that ever saw the Thunder Chief performance. And then they flew their fourth show at Patrick Air Force Base in Florida, and they had 8,000 people there. Heading up the coast, they flew their fifth demonstration at Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina, and they estimate they had 10,000 people there. For their sixth show, they flew across the country to Northwest Coast. On Saturday, May 9th at McCord Air Force Base, they performed in front of 35,000 people. And it was kind of interesting. You know, the Thunderbirds have a high show and they have a low show, you know, in case there are clouds and things like that. But they flew what one of the narrator described as a flat show. He didn't even call it a low show because the clouds were so low. Well, what do you expect in Washington State? Now, for their final show, they took off from McCord and they flew the 640 miles down to Hamilton Air Force Base just north of San Francisco. Their seventh show was scheduled for Saturday, May 10th, and was to be the key attraction at Hamilton's Armed Forces Day celebration. Now, I'm sure all of you are probably familiar with the normal Thunderbird pitch up to downwind, and I've actually flown this in a number of aircraft. It's kind of fun because it's very aggressive. You do a 6G pull up to about 40 degrees, and then you just essentially float up to the 1,500 foot pattern altitude. It's actually quite a fun maneuver. What about 6:15? The team flew a 6-ship formation down initial, and the left wing was being flown by Captain Devlin, and when he initiated the pitch up, the aircraft structurally failed. The aircraft broke into two, and the primary cause of the accident was material failure. The initial structure break is undetermined, but most likely was located in the fuselage backbone area, and this, of course, was an unsurvivable type of catastrophic breakup of the aircraft. A metal plate on top of the fuselage had failed, causing the plane to break apart after the cockpit. They later, of course, beat this area up. And due to the work involved, it became obvious there would be a considerable delay in releasing the F-105Bs back to the Thunderbirds. They began looking for replacement aircraft for the 1964 season. And after a couple days later, they released the aircraft, and they told them to fly it very gently to the depot. And they were flown to the depot and deconverted from Thunderbird livery and back into service. Now, the Thunderbirds thought, okay, what are we going to go to? They looked at the T-38 again, and they looked at the F-4, but they decided for the time being they would go back to F-100s. This is the aircraft they had experience in. But they went back, since the F-100Cs had been turned in and returned to squadrons, they went back and they used F-100Ds. And of course, it's interesting to note that when the F-105 broke up, there was a lot of debris on the runway, but these guys fly these air shows with what's known as air show fuel, which is not a lot of fuel. And Tower said the runway is closed, and Lead basically said, no, we're going to land. They didn't have the fuel to go anywhere else, and they came in and successfully land without hitting anything. But this was of course, shortest season on history for the Thunderbirds using a particular aircraft. And it is the first time that they left an aircraft because of an accident. The second time, of course, was 17 years later on January 18th, 1982, and I talk about that in another video discussing that, and that was during the practice session of the Thunderbirds flying the T-38. And they decided after that, they got rid of the T-38 and they went to the F-16s, which has proven to be just an amazing demonstration team. And a funny side story is I'm upgrading to captain on the Airbus 320, and I'm in school, and I sat down next to my stick buddy, my co-pilot, and I noticed that he's got his bag open, and he's got this little business card on it. It says Thunderbird number 1, Steve Anderson. And I said, that's you? And he goes, yeah, boss. So I got to have, as my stick buddy and co-pilot through training, lead of the Thunderbirds. And it was a really former lead of the Thunderbirds. He had been Thunderbird lead for 2 seasons. And we went up to Bremen, Germany for training because they didn't have enough simulators in the States for the training at the time. And we had a fun time over there in Germany. Flying the simulator and drinking beer till very early in the morning and touring northern Germany. Anyway, that's the story of the short time of the F-105 Bravo with the Thunderbirds. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.